Prophetic activation. Are you hearing God the right way? Prophetic activation is not a concept reserved for a select few, nor is it a mystical gift given only to those who stand on pulpits or speak before crowds. It is, at its core, the awakening of spiritual sensitivity, the moment when a believer begins to discern the voice of God beyond noise, beyond emotion, beyond personal desire. And yet, one of the greatest struggles in the life of any believer is not whether God is speaking, but whether they are hearing Him correctly. Many walk through life convinced that every strong feeling is divine direction, every open door is confirmation, and every inner voice is God's whisper. But what if the greatest danger is not silence from heaven, but misinterpretation? What if the voice you trust is not always the voice of God? This is where prophetic activation begins, not in speaking, but in listening, not in declaring, but in discerning. Because before you can ever become a vessel through which God speaks, you must first become a vessel that accurately hears. The truth is, God is always speaking. From the beginning of creation, His voice has been the force that shapes reality. "Let there be light" was not just a command, it was the release of divine intention into existence. That same voice has never ceased. The issue has never been God's silence, but humanity's inability to tune in. In a world filled with distractions, emotional turbulence, and spiritual noise, hearing God requires more than desire. It requires transformation. It requires alignment. It requires the death of certain internal patterns that distort what we hear. And this is where most believers struggle. They want clarity without surrender. They want direction without discipline. They want revelation without purification. But the prophetic is not activated through convenience. It is activated through consecration. Begins with the most fundamental question: what does it actually mean to hear God? And why do so many people get it wrong? To hear God is not merely to receive information. It is to enter into a relationship where communication flows in alignment with truth. God does not speak into chaos without first addressing the chaos within the listener. His voice is clear, but it is often filtered through the condition of the heart receiving it. This means that two people can pray about the same situation and walk away with completely different words from God. One may hear confirmation, while the other senses warning. One may feel peace, while the other feels restraint. The difference is not in God, it is in the internal state of the person listening. Your wounds speak, your fears speak, your desires speak. And sometimes they speak louder than God. This is why discernment is not optional, it is essential. The human heart has an incredible ability to disguise its own voice as divine instruction. When you want something badly enough, your mind begins to construct narratives that justify it. You start interpreting circumstances in ways that align with your desires. You begin to call impulse leading and emotion confirmation. But God's voice does not originate from your desires. It often confronts them. This is one of the clearest ways to begin distinguishing His voice from your own. While your flesh seeks comfort, God often calls you into growth. While your emotions seek immediate relief, God speaks in ways that produce long-term transformation. While your ego seeks validation, God's voice humbles, corrects, and refines. If what you are hearing always agrees with what you want, you must question whether you are truly hearing God. Prophetic activation begins when you develop the courage to challenge what you think you hear. It requires you to slow down instead of rushing to conclusions. It requires you to test impressions instead of immediately acting on them. It requires you to sit in silence long enough to allow the noise within you to settle, because God's voice is not chaotic. It does not compete for attention. It does not scream over your thoughts. It is steady, it is precise, it is anchored in truth. And yet many miss it because they are listening for something dramatic instead of something consistent. They expect thunder, but God often speaks in whispers. They expect overwhelming emotion, but God often speaks through quiet conviction. They expect urgency, but God often speaks with patience. This misunderstanding leads many to chase spiritual experiences instead of cultivating spiritual sensitivity. They look for signs, feelings, and external confirmations, while ignoring the internal work necessary to hear clearly. But prophetic activation is not about chasing experiences, it is about becoming aligned. Alignment is the key. When your thoughts are aligned with truth, your emotions submitted to discipline, and your desires surrendered to God's will, your ability to hear Him increases exponentially. Not because He starts speaking more, but because you begin hearing more clearly. Think of it like tuning a radio. The signal is always present, but unless you are on the right frequency, all you hear is static. Most people live in spiritual static. Their minds are filled with noise, opinions, fears, distractions, past experiences, and internal conflicts. And in that noise, God's voice becomes difficult to distinguish. This is why stillness is not optional in the prophetic. It is foundational. You cannot hear clearly if you are constantly overwhelmed internally. You cannot discern accurately if your emotions are unstable. You cannot interpret correctly if your perspective is distorted. And yet many try to operate prophetically without ever addressing these internal realities. They want to hear God, but they do not want to confront themselves. But prophetic clarity begins with internal honesty. You must be willing to ask yourself difficult questions. Am I hearing this because it is true, or because I want it to be true? Am I being led, or am I being driven by fear? Is this voice producing peace rooted in truth, or excitement rooted in desire? These questions are not signs of doubt, they are signs of maturity. Because true spiritual growth is not measured by how quickly you act, but by how accurately you discern. God is not impressed by impulsive obedience that is rooted in misunderstanding. He is honored by obedience that flows from clarity, alignment, and truth. And this brings us to one of the most overlooked realities of prophetic activation. God's voice will never contradict His nature. This may seem obvious, but it is where many believers fall into deception. They justify actions, decisions, and directions by claiming they heard from God, even when those directions contradict the very character of God revealed in Scripture. God does not lead through confusion. God does not manipulate through fear. God does not contradict truth to satisfy your emotions. If what you are hearing produces chaos, anxiety, pride, or self-exaltation, it is not God. His voice produces clarity, even when the message is difficult. His voice produces peace, even when the path is challenging. His voice produces humility, even when He is calling you higher. Learning to recognize these patterns is essential, because the goal of prophetic activation is not just to hear, it is to hear accurately. And accuracy comes through refinement. It comes through making mistakes and learning from them. It comes through testing what you hear against truth. It comes through developing a lifestyle of humility where you are more committed to being correct than to being right. This is where many stop. They want the identity of being prophetic, but not the process of becoming accurate. They want the authority, but not the accountability. They want the influence, but not the discipline. But God does not entrust clarity to those who are unwilling to be refined. The prophetic is not about status, it is about stewardship. And stewardship requires responsibility. Every time you say, "God told me," you are attaching His name to your interpretation. That is not a light thing. That is not something to be done casually. This is why the early stages of prophetic activation must be marked by caution, humility, and a deep commitment to truth. You must learn to hold what you hear with open hands. You must be willing to say, "This is what I sense," instead of "this is what God said," until clarity is confirmed, because maturity understands that hearing God is a process, not a performance. And as you begin to embrace this process, something shifts. You become less reactive and more responsive. You become less emotional and more discerning. You become less driven by urgency and more anchored in peace. And in that place, the voice of God becomes clearer, not louder, but clearer. Because clarity is not about volume, it is about alignment. And when alignment is established, prophetic activation is no longer confusing, it becomes natural, not because you have mastered something, but because you have surrendered to something greater than yourself. The three voices. Learning to distinguish God, yourself, and the enemy. One of the greatest reasons people struggle to hear God correctly is because they do not realize that not every voice inside them comes from the same source. Many assume that everything they think or feel is either their own mind or God speaking. But the spiritual reality is deeper than that. There are three primary voices that influence your inner world: the voice of God, the voice of your flesh, and the voice of the enemy. If you do not learn to distinguish between these three, you will constantly live in confusion, sometimes obeying your emotions, thinking they are divine, sometimes resisting God, thinking He is your fear, and sometimes following deception, thinking it is wisdom. Prophetic activation begins when you stop assuming and start discerning. The voice of God is consistent with truth, but it does not always align with comfort. It leads, it corrects, it invites, and it transforms. It speaks with authority, but not with pressure. It convicts, but does not condemn. The voice of your flesh is emotional, reactive, and driven by desire. It seeks comfort, control, validation, and immediate satisfaction. It is loud when it wants something and silent when discipline is required. It can sound convincing because it uses your own reasoning, your own logic, and your own preferences. The voice of the enemy is deceptive, subtle, and strategic. It rarely presents itself as something obviously evil. Instead, it twists truth just enough to lead you slightly off course. It can imitate urgency, fear, pride, or even false peace. And here is where it becomes dangerous. All three voices can sound similar if you are not trained to recognize their patterns. The enemy can quote truth, but distort its application. Your flesh can produce peace, but it is a peace rooted in avoidance, not alignment. And God can speak in ways that challenge your emotions, making His voice initially feel uncomfortable. This is why many people misinterpret what they hear. They assume that peace always means God, discomfort always means something is wrong, and urgency always means action is required. But this is not how spiritual discernment works. True prophetic sensitivity requires you to go deeper than surface feelings. You must begin to ask, what is the source of this voice? Not just what is being said, but where is it coming from? Because the source determines the outcome. The voice of God leads to life, even when the process is difficult. The voice of the flesh leads to temporary satisfaction, followed by emptiness. The voice of the enemy leads to confusion, delay, or destruction, often disguised as something good. Learning to distinguish these voices is not something that happens overnight. It is a process of training your inner perception through experience, reflection, and alignment with truth. One of the most important markers of God's voice is that it produces clarity over time. It may not give you all the answers immediately, but it will not leave you in constant confusion. Even when God is silent about certain details, there is a sense of direction, a quiet knowing that anchors you. The enemy, on the other hand, thrives in confusion. If what you are hearing constantly changes, contradicts itself, or creates internal chaos, it is not God. God does not speak in ways that destabilize your ability to trust Him. Your flesh creates a different kind of confusion. It convinces you that what you want is what you need. It builds arguments to justify your desires. It creates emotional narratives that feel true in the moment, but lack long-term stability. This is why self-awareness is critical in prophetic activation. You must become aware of your tendencies. What do you naturally want? What are you afraid of? What triggers your emotions? Because your flesh will often use these areas to influence how you interpret what you hear. For example, if you have a deep fear of rejection, your flesh may interpret God's silence as abandonment. If you have a strong desire for control, your flesh may interpret waiting as a sign to take action prematurely. And if you are not aware of these patterns, you will begin to build a false understanding of how God speaks. The enemy takes advantage of this. He studies your patterns. He observes your weaknesses. He identifies the areas where your discernment is not yet developed, and he introduces thoughts that align just enough with your internal tendencies to feel believable. This is why spiritual maturity is not just about knowing Scripture, it is about knowing yourself. Because the more you understand your own internal patterns, the harder it becomes for your flesh or the enemy to manipulate your perception. God's voice cuts through these patterns. It does not cater to your weaknesses, it transforms them. It does not reinforce your fears, it confronts them. It does not feed your ego, it refines it. And often this is why people resist it. Because God's voice requires surrender. It calls you to trust when you want control. It calls you to wait when you want movement. It calls you to let go when you want to hold on. This is why distinguishing his voice is not just a mental exercise, it is a spiritual posture. You cannot accurately hear God if you are unwilling to obey him, because your willingness to obey directly affects your ability to recognize his voice. If you are only open to hearing what aligns with your desires, you will filter out everything else. And over time, you will begin to believe that God only says what you want him to say. This is one of the most subtle forms of deception, because it feels spiritual, but it is actually self-centered. True prophetic activation requires a different posture. It requires you to say, God, I want to hear you, even if what you say challenges me. This posture creates space for clarity. It removes the filters that distort your perception. It allows you to receive without immediately interpreting through the lens of your desires. Another key difference between these voices is how they handle time. The flesh is impatient. It wants answers now, results now, movement now. The enemy often creates false urgency, pushing you to act before you have clarity. God operates with precision. He is not rushed, and he does not rush you. When God speaks, there is often a sense of timing attached to it, a knowing of when to act, when to wait, and when to remain still. Learning to recognize this is crucial, because many people make decisions not because God spoke, but because they felt pressure. Pressure is not the language of God. Clarity is. Even when the instruction is difficult, there is a sense of grounded certainty, not emotional pressure, but spiritual alignment. As you grow in this, you will begin to notice patterns. You will start to recognize how God speaks to you personally, because while his nature is consistent, his communication can be unique to each individual. Some hear through thoughts that come with unusual clarity, others through a deep inner knowing that is hard to explain, others through Scripture coming alive in specific moments, others through patterns and confirmations that align over time. But regardless of how he speaks, the source remains the same. And the more you learn to recognize his voice, the less confusing it becomes. You stop second-guessing every impression. You stop being driven by emotional highs and lows. You stop needing constant external confirmation, because internally something has been trained. Your spiritual senses become sharper, your discernment becomes more precise, and what once felt uncertain begins to feel familiar. This is the beginning of true prophetic activation, not when you start speaking for God, but when you start hearing him accurately. because everything else flows from that. If you hear incorrectly, you will speak incorrectly. If you interpret wrongly, you will act wrongly. But if you learn to distinguish the voices within you, you begin to move with clarity, and clarity changes everything. It removes fear. It removes hesitation. It removes confusion, because you are no longer guessing, you are discerning. And in that place, your relationship with God deepens. It becomes less about trying to figure things out and more about walking in alignment. You begin to trust not just that God speaks, but that you can recognize His voice, and that trust becomes the foundation for everything that follows. Testing the voice, how to discern truth and avoid deception. Prophetic activation does not reach maturity when you begin to hear. It reaches maturity when you begin to test what you hear. This is where many fail. They receive impressions, thoughts, feelings, and immediately assign them divine authority without examination. But spiritual accuracy is not built on assumption, it is built on testing. If you do not test what you hear, you will eventually be deceived, not because God failed to guide you, but because you failed to discern correctly. The ability to test the voice is what separates spiritual immaturity from spiritual authority. It is the difference between being led and being misled. And yet, many believers resist this process because they confuse testing with doubt. They think questioning what they hear means they lack faith. But in reality, testing is an act of reverence. It is the recognition that God's voice is too important to misrepresent. It is the humility to admit that your perception can be wrong, even when your intention is right. This is the beginning of true discernment. To test the voice of God, you must establish anchors, unchanging references that allow you to evaluate what you hear. Without anchors, your discernment will be based on emotion, and emotion is unstable. The first and most important anchor is truth. God will never contradict His nature. He will never lead you in a direction that opposes His character. This means that anything you hear must align with the core attributes of who God is: truthful, consistent, just, patient, and purposeful. If what you hear promotes confusion, pride, manipulation, or self-exaltation, it is not from Him. This seems simple, but in practice, it requires depth. Because deception rarely presents itself as obvious falsehood. It often appears as partial truth. It sounds close enough to be believable, but slightly altered in a way that leads you off course. This is why surface-level understanding is not enough. You must know truth deeply enough to recognize distortion. The second anchor is peace rooted in alignment, not emotion. Many people misunderstand peace. They think peace is the absence of discomfort, but that is not always true. Your flesh can feel comfortable while being completely out of alignment, and God can call you into something uncomfortable that is fully aligned with His will. True peace is not the absence of challenge, it is the presence of stability. It is a quiet confidence that remains even when your emotions fluctuate. When God speaks, there's a depth to the peace that does not depend on circumstances. It may not remove all fear, but it grounds you beneath it. It does not always feel exciting, but it feels steady. This is different from emotional relief. Emotional relief is immediate, reactive, and often temporary. It comes when you choose what feels easiest, not necessarily what is right. Learning to distinguish between these two is essential, because many people mistake emotional comfort for divine confirmation. The third anchor is time. God's voice withstands time. If something is truly from Him, it will not collapse under patience. It will not require immediate action to remain valid. It will not pressure you into rushing before clarity is established. This is one of the clearest ways to expose false impressions. If what you feel or hear demands urgency without clarity, it is likely not God, because God does not fear time. He is not threatened by your waiting. In fact, waiting often reveals the truth. When you sit with what you believe you heard, One of three things will happen. It will become clearer, it will fade, or it will shift. If it becomes clearer over time, gaining depth and consistency, it is likely aligned with truth. If it fades quickly, it was likely emotional or impulsive. If it shifts or contradicts itself, it was likely influenced by confusion. Time filters voices, but most people do not allow time to do its work. They rush to act because they are afraid of missing something. But you cannot miss what God has truly spoken. If He said it, it will remain. This is why patience is not passive, it is protective. Another critical aspect of testing the voice is confirmation through alignment, not coincidence. Many people look for signs everywhere. They interpret random events, repeated numbers, conversations, or circumstances as confirmation of what they believe they heard. But this can become dangerous if not grounded in discernment, because when you are looking for confirmation, your mind begins to notice patterns that support your belief. This is not always God. It is often your perception reinforcing itself. True confirmation is not random. It is aligned. It does not rely on isolated events, but on consistent patterns that point in the same direction. It does not create confusion. It reduces it. It does not require interpretation. It becomes increasingly clear. And most importantly, it aligns with truth, peace, and timing. This is how God confirms, not through chaos, but through clarity. Another essential layer of testing is accountability. Mature discernment does not operate in isolation. When you are developing your ability to hear God, it is important to have grounded, spiritually mature voices in your life who can help you process what you are hearing, not to control you, but to sharpen you, because sometimes you are too close to your own situation to see clearly. Your emotions are involved, your desires are active, and your perspective can become narrow. But when you bring what you sense into the light, it can be tested more accurately. Not everyone will understand, and not everyone should be consulted. But wise, grounded voices can help you see what you might be missing. This is not a sign of weakness, it is a sign of wisdom. Even the most spiritually mature individuals remain accountable because they understand that clarity is strengthened through humility. Pride is one of the greatest threats to prophetic accuracy. When you become convinced that you always hear correctly, you stop testing. And when you stop testing, you become vulnerable to deception. Because the moment you believe you cannot be wrong is the moment you stop growing. This is why humility must remain at the center of prophetic activation. You must always remain teachable, always willing to reevaluate, always open to correction, because accuracy is not a one-time achievement. It is a continuous process. And as you grow in this process, something begins to change within you. You become less reactive to every thought and more intentional about what you accept as truth. You stop being driven by every feeling and start discerning their source. You begin to notice when something feels off, even if you cannot immediately explain why. This is your discernment developing. It is not always loud, it is not always obvious, but it is consistent, and over time, it becomes one of your most valuable spiritual tools. You begin to trust it, not blindly, but confidently, because it has been tested. This is the goal, not to become someone who hears voices constantly, but someone who recognizes truth consistently, because prophetic activation is not about volume, it is about accuracy. It is not about frequency, it is about clarity. And clarity is built through testing. Every time you test what you hear, you refine your perception. You learn what aligns and what does not. You begin to recognize patterns. You become more sensitive to truth and less influenced by distortion. And eventually, what once required effort becomes instinctive, not because you have mastered something, but because you have been trained through experience. This is how spiritual maturity is formed, not through moments, but through patterns, not through intensity, but through consistency. And as you continue in this process, your confidence grows, not in yourself, but in your ability to recognize what is from God, and that confidence changes how you live. You become less anxious about making the wrong decision, less fearful of missing direction, less dependent on external validation, because internally something has been established, a foundation of discernment. And from that foundation, you begin to move differently, with clarity, with stability, with peace, not because you always have all the answers, but because you know how to test what you hear, and that makes all the difference. The posture of alignment. Why surrender determines clarity. Prophetic activation is not sustained by techniques, methods, or spiritual formulas. It is sustained by posture. And the most important posture you can develop if you truly want to hear God clearly is surrender, not partial surrender. Not conditional surrender, but complete alignment of your will with His. Because the truth is simple yet uncomfortable. You will only hear God clearly to the degree that you are willing to obey Him fully. Many people struggle with clarity not because God is silent, but because they are divided. Part of them wants God's direction, but another part wants control. Part of them desires truth, but another part resists change. And in that internal division, their perception becomes distorted, because you cannot hear clearly when your heart is negotiating. Surrender removes negotiation. It is the decision that says, God, whatever you say, I will follow, even if it costs me comfort, control, or understanding. And this is where clarity begins to increase. Because once your heart is no longer filtering what it hears through preference, it becomes open to receive truth as it is, not as you wish it to be. This is one of the most overlooked realities in the prophetic. Clarity is not just about hearing, it is about willingness. If you are only willing to follow certain instructions, you will only clearly hear those instructions. Everything else will feel uncertain, confusing, or distant. Not because God is unclear, but because your heart is selective. And selective hearing leads to distorted interpretation. This is why surrender is not a one-time decision. It is a daily posture. Every day you must realign your heart. Every day you must release your expectations. Every day you must let go of your need to control outcomes. Because the moment you begin to hold onto your own agenda, your perception begins to shift. You start hearing through the lens of what you want instead of what is true. And this is subtle. It does not feel like rebellion. It feels like reasoning. It feels like logic. It feels like you are still seeking God. But in reality, you are seeking confirmation, not direction. And confirmation is dangerous when it replaces surrender. Because when you seek confirmation, you are not asking, God, what do you want? You are asking, God, do you agree with what I want? And if you are not careful, you will begin to interpret everything as agreement. This is why surrender must come first, before clarity, before direction, before activation. Because surrender positions your heart to receive truth without distortion. It removes the internal resistance that interferes with discernment. It creates space for God's voice to be recognized, even when it challenges you. And this is where many people stop. They want the prophetic without the cost of surrender. They want to hear God, but they do not want to die to themselves. But Jesus made it clear, to follow Him requires denial of self, and this applies directly to hearing Him, because the more you hold on to yourself, the less clearly you will hear Him. The more you release yourself, the clearer His voice becomes. This is not because God is withholding clarity. It is because surrender removes the interference. Think of it like a lens. If the lens is covered with layers of dust, fear, desire, pride, control, you can still see, but everything is distorted. Surrender cleans the lens. It does not create the image, it reveals it. And as the lens becomes clearer, so does your perception. You begin to notice the difference between your voice and His. You begin to recognize when something is aligned and when it is not. You begin to sense direction without forcing it. This is the fruit of surrender, but surrender is not passive. It is active. It requires intentional decisions. It requires you to say no to things that feel right but are not aligned. It requires you to wait when you want to move. It requires you to trust when you do not understand. And most importantly, it requires consistency. Because surrender is tested in moments, not in theory, but in real decisions. When you are faced with a choice, follow what is easy or follow what is true, that is where your alignment is revealed. And every time you choose truth over comfort, your sensitivity to God's voice increases, not instantly but progressively, because you are training your heart to prioritize alignment over desire. And this changes everything. You begin to notice that hearing God becomes less confusing, not because you have learned new techniques, but because you have removed internal resistance. You are no longer filtering His voice through layers of personal agenda. You are receiving it as it is, and this creates stability. You are not constantly questioning everything. You are not being pulled in different directions by your emotions. You are anchored, and that anchor is surrender. Another important aspect of this posture is trust, because surrender without trust becomes fear. If you do not trust God's nature, you will struggle to fully surrender to His voice. You will question His intentions. You will hesitate in obedience. You will second-guess what you hear. But when trust is established, surrender becomes natural. Not easy, but natural, because you know that His direction is not random, it is purposeful, even when it does not make sense, even when it requires sacrifice, even when it leads you into uncertainty. You trust that His voice leads to life, and this trust allows you to move without needing full understanding. It allows you to obey without needing constant confirmation. It allows you to walk in alignment even when the path is not fully visible. This is where prophetic activation becomes powerful. Because it is no longer based on occasional clarity, it becomes a lifestyle of alignment. You are not just hearing God in specific moments, you are walking with Him consistently. And in that consistency, your sensitivity deepens, your discernment sharpens, your confidence grows, not in yourself, but in your relationship with Him. You begin to recognize His voice more quickly. You begin to respond more accurately. You begin to move with less hesitation. Because internally, something has shifted. You are no longer trying to hear God. You are aligned with Him. And alignment changes everything. It removes confusion. It reduces noise. It simplifies decisions, because instead of asking, "What do I want?" you are asking, "What is aligned?" And that question leads to clarity, not always immediate, but consistent, and consistency builds confidence. This is why surrender is not optional in the prophetic, it is foundational. Without it, you may hear occasionally, but you will not hear consistently. You may experience moments of clarity, but you will not sustain them, because your internal state will continue to interfere with your perception. But with surrender, everything begins to stabilize. Your emotions no longer control your interpretation. Your desires no longer distort your hearing. Your fears no longer dominate your decisions. You become steady. And in that steadiness, God's voice becomes clearer. Not because it has changed, but because you have. This is the hidden key to prophetic activation. Not more effort, not more striving, but more surrender. Because the more you release, the more you receive. The more you let go, the more clearly you see. And the more aligned you become, the more natural it is to hear. Not as something distant or rare, but as something consistent and real. And this is where everything begins to come together. Because hearing God is not about chasing a voice, it is about becoming aligned with the one who speaks. And when that alignment is established, clarity is no longer something you struggle to find. It becomes something you walk in, living in prophetic clarity. From moments of hearing to a lifestyle of alignment, prophetic activation reaches its full expression Not when you occasionally hear God, but when your entire life becomes aligned with His voice. This is the transition most people never make. They have moments of clarity, moments of direction, moments where they feel certain God has spoken, but those moments remain isolated. They do not translate into a consistent way of living, and because of that, their spiritual life becomes unstable. One day they feel guided, the next they feel lost. One moment they are confident, the next they are uncertain. Not because God has changed, but because they have not yet developed consistency in how they walk with Him. This is where prophetic maturity is formed, not in isolated experiences, but in daily alignment. The goal is not to hear God occasionally. The goal is to live in such a way that hearing Him becomes natural, not forced, not dramatic, not rare, but consistent. And this consistency is built through patterns. The patterns you establish in your daily life determine the clarity you experience in your spiritual life. If your life is filled with noise, distraction, inconsistency, and emotional instability, your ability to hear clearly will be affected. Not because God is silent, but because your environment is loud. This is why prophetic clarity is not just spiritual, it is practical. It is shaped by how you think, how you respond, how you manage your time, how you handle your emotions, and how you prioritize your attention. Everything influences your sensitivity. This is a truth many overlook. They separate their spiritual life from their daily habits, not realizing that their habits are either sharpening or dulling their discernment. If you want to live in prophetic clarity, you must become intentional about your internal environment. What you allow into your mind matters. What you dwell on matters. What you repeatedly expose yourself to shapes your perception. Because your mind is not neutral, it is responsive. It adapts to what you feed it. And over time, what you feed it becomes what you filter through. This is why many people struggle to hear God. They're constantly feeding their minds with noise, endless opinions, distractions, emotional triggers, and external influences that compete with the stillness required to discern. And then they expect clarity in the middle of chaos. But clarity requires space, it requires stillness, it requires moments where you are not reacting, not consuming, not distracted, but present. This is where sensitivity grows, not in constant activity, but in intentional stillness. This does not mean withdrawing from life. It means creating space within it. Space to reflect, space to process, space to listen. Because if you are always moving, always reacting, always consuming, you will not notice the subtle ways God speaks. His voice is not absent, it is often overlooked. And this is why consistency matters more than intensity. Many people chase intense spiritual moments, powerful experiences, emotional highs, dramatic encounters. And while those moments can be meaningful, they are not the foundation of prophetic clarity. The foundation is consistency, daily alignment, small repeated decisions to remain sensitive, aware, and surrendered. This is what builds stability. This is what trains your perception. This is what transforms hearing from an event into a lifestyle. And as this lifestyle develops, something shifts. You no longer rely on specific moments to feel connected to God. You begin to carry that connection into everything. Decisions become clearer, not because you hear an audible voice every time, but because your discernment has been trained. You begin to sense what is aligned and what is not. You begin to recognize direction without needing constant confirmation. You begin to move with quiet confidence. This is prophetic clarity. Not constant instruction, but consistent alignment. Not dramatic communication, but steady awareness. Not external dependence, but internal stability. And this stability changes how you respond to uncertainty. because uncertainty is part of life. There will always be moments where you do not have full clarity, moments where you are waiting, where you are processing, where you are unsure of the next step. But when you live in alignment, uncertainty does not produce anxiety, it produces trust. You are able to remain steady even when you do not have all the answers, because your confidence is not in knowing everything, it is in being aligned with the one who does. This removes pressure, the pressure to figure everything out immediately, the pressure to make perfect decisions, the pressure to constantly hear something new. Instead, you begin to rest in what you already know. You begin to trust what has already been established. You begin to move forward with what is clear instead of being paralyzed by what is not. This is maturity, and maturity brings freedom. You are no longer dependent on constant reassurance. You are no longer driven by emotional fluctuations. You are no longer confused by every new thought or feeling. You are anchored, and from that place, your ability to hear God becomes more refined. Because you are not constantly resetting your alignment, you are maintaining it. This is the difference between occasional clarity and sustained clarity. One is reactive, the other is rooted. And this rootedness is what allows you to grow, because growth requires stability. You cannot build something strong on an unstable foundation. And prophetic clarity is no different. It must be built on consistency, alignment, and discipline. Not discipline in a rigid sense, but in a focused sense. The discipline to guard your mind, the discipline to manage your emotions, the discipline to remain still when necessary, the discipline to test what you hear, the discipline to surrender when it is difficult. These disciplines are not restrictions, they are protections. They protect your clarity, they protect your sensitivity, they protect your ability to discern accurately, and over time they become natural. What once required effort becomes instinctive. What once felt difficult becomes normal, and this is when prophetic activation becomes fully integrated into your life. It is no longer something you try to do, it is something you are. You become someone who hears, discerns, and responds in alignment, not perfectly, but consistently. And consistency produces confidence. Not arrogance, but assurance, a quiet knowing that you are not walking blindly, that you are not making decisions in isolation, that you are not dependent on guesswork, but that you are aligned with a voice that is steady, reliable, and true. And this changes everything, because when you live in that alignment, fear loses its control, confusion loses its power, and uncertainty loses its weight. You begin to walk differently, with intention, with clarity, with peace. Not because life is easier, but because your foundation is stronger. And this is the ultimate goal of prophetic activation. Not just to hear God, but to walk with Him. Not just to receive direction, but to live in alignment. Not just to have moments of clarity, but to become a person of clarity. Because when you become that person, everything changes. Your decisions change, your responses change, your perspective changes. And your life begins to reflect something deeper, something stable, something aligned, something true. And that is where prophetic activation reaches its fullness. Not in what you hear, but in how you live.